My wife lied about pregnancy while I sold my car to prepare, so I exposed messages, filed annulment, and took back my life calmly finally. I'm a 31-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, I believed that being a husband meant giving everything, your time, your energy, your money, without ever asking for anything in return. I met her at one of the most stressful periods of my career, when I was juggling late nights, tight deadlines, and the constant pressure to prove myself. She was different, charming, persuasive, and somehow capable of making me feel like I had finally met someone who could truly understand me, someone I could build a life with. We spent hours talking about the future, sharing ambitions, and dreaming about a family that would be ours, a life where we would both shine. Growing up, I was always the responsible one. My parents relied on me to fix problems quietly, plan ahead, and hold everyone together when things fell apart. That mindset didn't stop when I met her. It felt natural to step into the role of provider, planner, and emotional anchor. She noticed, of course, and I think part of why I fell for her so quickly was how she made my sense of duty feel appreciated, like it was love being reciprocated rather than a burden being accepted. Early in our marriage, I started taking on more than I probably should have. Covering rent, utilities, extra bills, even minor luxuries she insisted would make life easier. I convinced myself that this was part of building a future together. Every transaction, every sleepless night spent worrying about finances, felt like an investment in our shared dreams. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late one night, counting bills and receipts, feeling exhausted but proud. There was a strange kind of honor in being the one holding everything together, in being the rock she leaned on without question. At the time, I genuinely thought this was love in its purest form, until the first cracks started showing, subtle enough to ignore, but persistent enough to unsettle me. I still remember the day she told me she was pregnant. I was sitting on the couch, laptop balanced on my knees, staring at spreadsheets and deadlines, when she walked in with that soft smile that always made my chest tighten. "I have news," she said, eyes sparkling. And just like that, everything I thought I knew about responsibility and sacrifice gained a new dimension. The excitement hit me instantly, but so did the pressure. I knew that preparing for a child meant more than love, it meant sacrifice on a scale I hadn't fully imagined yet. I sold my car that week. My pride, my independence, my sense of stability, I traded it all for what I thought was our future. Furniture, prenatal vitamins, medical bills, savings, I funneled everything I could into preparing for a life I thought we were building together. I told myself it was worth it, that this was what love meant, putting someone else first, even when it hurt. At first, it was almost magical. We painted the nursery, shopped for tiny clothes, and made lists of names we liked. She was charmingly anxious, insisting she needed me to be the one making sure everything ran smoothly while she rested and focused on the pregnancy. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said more than once, and I believed her. But little things started nagging at the back of my mind. Missed appointments, vague stories about doctor visits, I forgot, explanations that seemed too convenient. I brushed them off, thinking, maybe I'm just stressed, maybe this is normal pregnancy fatigue. I kept working late nights, budgeting tighter, sacrificing more, all while the unease quietly settled in like a shadow in the corner of my apartment. I couldn't have known then that this was the start of a series of lies, each one more calculated than the last, and that my pride and trust were about to be weaponized against me. I went to bed that night feeling exhausted but proud, completely unaware that the very thing I was preparing for might never exist. The doubt started small, almost imperceptible, like whispers I tried to ignore. I noticed her phone buzzing more often, disappearing into other rooms to answer calls, and sometimes she would hastily lock her screen when I walked by. "Just work stuff," she'd say, her tone light but a little sharp, as if she didn't want me asking questions. I told myself it was normal, that maybe the stress of pregnancy and work was making her irritable. But the nagging feeling in my chest refused to disappear, growing heavier with every vague excuse and dodged explanation. I began paying attention to the small inconsistencies, dates of doctor visits that didn't match, receipts that seemed out of place, and stories that changed depending on who she was talking to. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything I had taken for granted. Am I imagining this? Am I being paranoid? I muttered to myself, pacing the apartment, trying to calm the growing storm inside me. Her charm was still there, of course, smiles, gentle touches, and soft reassurances that everything was fine. "You're doing so much for me, for us," she'd whisper, and I would melt, reminding myself that love required trust. But trust felt like a fragile glass in my hands, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was sliding beneath the surface. I started keeping a mental log, noting every missing appointment, every contradicting statement, every moment that left me uneasy. It was exhausting, but I felt I had no choice. My instincts were screaming that I needed to pay attention before it was too late. The tension in our home became palpable. Conversations that once flowed freely were now punctuated with pauses and half-smiles, the air thick with unspoken doubts. I told myself to wait, to observe, to be patient, but deep down, I knew that the calm surface of our life was hiding something much darker, something I was only beginning to sense. And then came the first moment that made my stomach drop, a text notification from her phone that she insisted I shouldn't see, but my eyes caught it anyway, and the words on that screen made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt before. It happened one evening when I noticed a missed call from her on her phone, something I hadn't seen before, because she usually left it out in the open. "Oh, that was just a friend," she said, her voice a little too light, a little too quick, as if rehearsed. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach tightened. There was something about the way she avoided my gaze, the subtle shift in her posture, that made every instinct I had scream, "Something isn't right." I spent the next few hours replaying every conversation, every excuse she had given me about doctor visits or appointments, trying to make sense of the unease building inside me. I started noticing the little things that had previously seemed insignificant, the way she would double-check her messages when I entered the room, the unexplained nights out, with friends, and the vague answers whenever I asked for details. My mind became a constant loop, questioning my own judgment. "Maybe I'm overthinking," I muttered to myself in the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection as if it could reassure me. But the reflection only stared back, tired and tense, carrying the weight of a suspicion I couldn't shake. Our apartment began to feel smaller, heavier. The air seemed thick with unspoken truths, and every shared glance carried an undercurrent of unease. I started tensing before conversations, bracing myself for deflection, for denial, for the subtle gaslighting that made me question reality. I realized that trust, once effortless, had become a careful balancing act, a fragile currency I couldn't spend freely anymore. One night, I overheard a half-laughed comment she made while texting in the other room, something fleeting but pointed, something that contradicted everything she had told me about the pregnancy. I froze, my heart pounding, listening to the words I wasn't supposed to hear. It was subtle, almost innocuous, but it hit me like a punch. This was not fatigue, this was deception. I tried to convince myself to confront her calmly, to wait for clarity, but my gut refused. Something was festering under the surface, and I knew that ignoring it would only make the inevitable fallout worse. By the end of that week, I was no longer just uneasy, I was on high alert, sensing the first real cracks in what I had believed was an unshakable bond. And I had no idea how deep those cracks would go. It hit me like a freight train one evening. I stumbled across her messages by accident, a string of conversations that made my chest tighten so badly I could barely breathe. There it was, in black and white, jokes, manipulations, casual lies about the pregnancy, all exchanged with people she trusted to keep her secret. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, staring at the screen as disbelief and rage collided inside me. "This can't be real," I whispered, my voice cracking. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I had poured into what I thought was our shared future suddenly felt like it had been weaponized against me. I replayed every moment in my head, the excitement, the late-night nursery planning, the reassurance she gave me when I sold my car to prepare. All of it had been a carefully constructed lie. I could feel my hands shaking as I scrolled through more messages, sarcastic comments about my naivety, plans to take advantage of my devotion, casual cruelty hidden behind playful words. I "I can't believe this," I muttered, staring at her texts as if reading them could somehow make them disappear. The shock was overwhelming, but amidst the haze of disbelief, a strange clarity emerged. I realized I couldn't let emotion dictate my next steps. If I reacted impulsively, I'd lose control. Instead, I began meticulously documenting everything: screenshots, dates, financial records, every single proof of her manipulation. I felt a flicker of empowerment in that act, a sense that I could reclaim some control even while my world felt like it was crumbling. The tension in the apartment became unbearable. I couldn't look at her the same way, couldn't hear her laugh without imagining the deception behind it. The thought that the life I was building had been a mirage made my stomach churn. I was at a crossroads. One path led to explosive confrontation, the other to a slow, deliberate plan for exposure. I sat there that night, staring at the wall, the messages still on my phone, and realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The betrayal was total, and the stakes had escalated far beyond anything I could have anticipated. And in that silence, I understood that the moment I had been dreading, facing the truth, was finally here. I had never felt so hollow in my life. The messages kept replaying in my mind like a broken record, each one another reminder of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Everything I had believed about trust, love, and honesty had been shattered. Sitting alone on the floor of our apartment, I felt like a fool, a man who had poured his heart, his money, his life into a fantasy that wasn't real. The weight of betrayal pressed on me so heavily that even breathing felt like an effort. Every corner of our home seemed tainted by her lies: the nursery we'd painted together, the baby clothes folded neatly in the closet, the receipts for appointments that never happened. I walked past them, feeling my stomach churn with rage, sadness, and disbelief all at once. How could someone do this? I whispered into the empty room, my voice trembling. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the car I had sold, the nights I spent awake worrying about a child that didn't exist. The realization that I had been manipulated so completely sent a shiver down my spine. I tried calling a few friends, anyone who could reassure me that I wasn't imagining things. Their words were sympathetic but hollow. They couldn't feel the betrayal the way I did, couldn't understand the depth of the emotional manipulation I'd endured. I felt isolated, trapped in a nightmare that had no clear escape. The thought of confronting her immediately made my stomach knot. I needed a plan, but I was desperate to act, desperate to scream, desperate to make her feel just a fraction of the devastation I was drowning in. That night, I sat at the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at her messages over and over. I felt a mix of rage and sorrow that threatened to swallow me whole. My world had imploded, and for the first time in my life, I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. And as I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, one thought repeated itself over and over: I had to be careful, because acting too soon could destroy any chance of reclaiming my life. I realized quickly that rage alone wouldn't fix anything. If I reacted impulsively, I'd give her control over the narrative, and after everything, I couldn't let her win that. So I took a deep breath and began to plan. Every message, every bank statement, every proof of her deception, I documented it all meticulously. I created folders, screenshots, timelines. I became a quiet archivist of my own betrayal. The process was exhausting, but oddly empowering, like reclaiming fragments of my life one piece at a time. I reached out to a lawyer discreetly, explaining the situation without letting her suspect a thing. I needed to understand my options: annulment, legal protections, reclaiming my finances, all without escalating the situation prematurely. Sitting in the consultation room, listening to the lawyer outline the steps, I felt a strange sense of relief. There was a path forward, a way to regain control, and for the first time since discovering the lies, I felt a flicker of hope. At home, I continued to act calm, playing the part of the unsuspecting husband. She remained unaware that I had uncovered everything, that her carefully constructed lies were now documented and organized. I watched her behaviors more closely, noticing the subtle panic when she assumed I was oblivious. Every small sign was a confirmation that I was in the right, and that careful, deliberate action would give me the upper hand. The tension in the apartment was almost unbearable. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I told myself to stay focused, to channel anger into strategy rather than chaos. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and heartbreak, a cold clarity settled over me. The betrayal had been complete, but so would my response be. That night, I went to bed with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. The messages, the lies, the manipulation, they were no longer weapons against me, they were tools, evidence that would allow me to take back my life. And as I closed my eyes, I knew the confrontation was coming. It was only a matter of time before everything changed. The day of the confrontation arrived quietly, almost unnervingly so. I waited until she was home, making it look like a normal evening, then asked her to sit down at the kitchen table with me. Her brow furrowed in confusion, but she complied, smiling faintly as if nothing had changed. I placed my phone and printed screenshots in front of her, along with bank statements and receipts that traced every sacrifice I had made for a child that never existed. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation," I said calmly, my voice steady, betraying none of the storm inside me. Her initial reaction was disbelief. What is this?" she stammered, eyes darting between the documents. I explained, methodically, everything I had discovered, the messages, the lies, the manipulations, and the financial preparations I had made based on her deception. I sold my car. I rearranged my life. And for what? I asked, my hands flat on the table. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. No excuses. No gaslighting. Just the truth, and now, the consequences. I could see the panic rising in her eyes, then a flash of anger, quickly followed by desperation. "You don't understand." It wasn't like that," she cried, but her voice lacked conviction, sounded hollow. I read the messages aloud, each word cutting sharper than the last, highlighting how casually she had treated my devotion. She tried to interrupt, to soften the damage, but I let nothing escape her. Every word she had sent, every lie she had told, was laid bare, undeniable. The apartment was thick with tension, the air seemed almost electric, charged with years of suppressed truths now exploding into daylight. I remained calm, my pulse steady, my eyes unwavering. And as the reality of her deception sank in, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the way I had been. I was empowered. And in that moment, I understood that I now held the control I had been denied for months. Even as she sat there, trembling and defensive, I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. The real shift, the reclaiming of my life, was about to start. Filing for annulment felt surreal, almost clinical, after months of emotional chaos. I went through the legal steps quietly, deliberately, making sure everything was airtight. Fraudulent claims, documented lies, manipulated finances, it all formed a concrete foundation for ending a marriage that had never been real. The lawyer walked me through each stage, explaining how the annulment would not just dissolve the marriage but protect my rights, reclaim my assets, and formally recognize the deception I had endured. I listened intently, feeling a strange combination of relief and vindication settle over me. Back at home, she was aware now that I knew everything, but she couldn't stop the process. I watched her shift uneasily, her attempts at casual conversation falling flat, her charm no longer effective. It was a quiet satisfaction, seeing the panic behind her eyes as the legal wheels turned, knowing that the deception she had wielded as power was now powerless against me. I didn't gloat, I didn't yell or scream. I simply stayed calm, deliberate, letting the facts speak louder than any emotional theatrics. Friends and family slowly became aware of what had happened. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to admiration, but most importantly, I felt seen. Not just as the trusting husband who had been duped, but as someone who had handled the situation with composure, strategy, and dignity. Every document submitted, every form signed, felt like a reclaiming of my life, my choices, and my sense of self. I could feel the heavy weight of betrayal lifting, replaced by something steadier, control. Even as the annulment process progressed, I continued to rebuild small pieces of my life. I reviewed my finances, reorganized my home, and reconnected with friends I had neglected during the storm. Each step was deliberate, a reinforcement of the fact that I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. And yet, beneath the relief and empowerment, I knew one truth: this wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about reclaiming every part of myself she had tried to manipulate. By the end of the week, as I filed the final paperwork, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in months. The betrayal was still raw, but the control was mine. And for the first time, I could see a future that wasn't defined by her lies. Rebuilding my life after the annulment felt both strange and liberating. For months, I had been consumed by disbelief, anger, and the exhaustion of constant vigilance. Now, I could finally breathe. I started reconnecting with friends and family I had distanced myself from during the chaos, explaining pieces of what had happened in careful, measured doses. Their support reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that my life wasn't defined by someone else's lies. It was a small, grounding comfort, like finding solid footing after walking on unstable ground for so long. I also began to focus on myself in ways I hadn't allowed before. I revisited hobbies I had abandoned, spent evenings reading or running without guilt, and allowed myself to laugh again without the shadow of deception looming over me. It was strange, almost foreign, to invest time in myself without thinking I was being selfish. I realized that years of sacrificing, of bending over backward to accommodate someone else's manipulation, had left me disconnected from my own desires. Now, I could start reclaiming them, piece by piece. Financially, I began putting everything back in order. I reclaimed my car, organized my accounts, and started saving again, this time for my own future. Each small victory felt like proof that I could rebuild stronger, smarter, and more cautious, without losing the capacity to trust entirely. And while the anger and heartbreak still lingered in quiet moments, they no longer controlled me, they were evidence of a lesson learned, a reminder to value myself above empty promises. Evenings in the apartment felt lighter. The air no longer carried the weight of deception, only the faint echoes of a past that had shaped me but no longer defined me. And as I looked around, organizing, cleaning, and reclaiming the space as my own, I felt something I hadn't in months: clarity. The betrayal had been devastating, yes, but the calm, deliberate steps I had taken were transforming the wreckage into a foundation for a life I truly controlled. I knew there would still be moments of reflection, of sadness, and even anger, but for the first time, I could face them on my own terms. And that realization, that quiet empowerment, felt like the truest kind of victory. Sitting alone one evening, I reflected on everything that had happened, and the lessons hit me harder than any confrontation or legal victory could. I realized how my devotion had been weaponized, how my trust had been treated like a game, and how easily love could be twisted into manipulation when boundaries weren't respected. I thought about the sleepless nights, the financial strain, the emotional turmoil, and understood that my self-worth had been tied too tightly to someone else's lies. "I can't let this happen again," I whispered to myself, and for the first time, I meant it. I started analyzing patterns I had ignored: subtle manipulations, casual gaslighting, the charm that disguised deceit. Recognizing these red flags in hindsight was painful, but empowering. I realized that trusting instincts and documenting inconsistencies wasn't paranoia, it was self-preservation. I made a mental note to never compromise my well-being for someone else's convenience or control, no matter how convincing their charm. I also began thinking about the emotional tools I had developed through the ordeal: patience, meticulous planning, and calm confrontation. I understood that these weren't just survival tactics, they were skills I could carry forward, skills that could protect me and guide me toward healthier relationships in the future. I even found myself drafting advice in my head for others who might be blindsided by lies and betrayal, imagining the words I would offer: document. Trust your instincts. Stay calm. Protect yourself first. Reflecting on the betrayal, I realized something important: I wasn't bitter, at least not in the destructive way I had feared. I had been hurt, yes, devastated even, but the experience forced growth, clarity, and self-respect. I began to accept that betrayal, as painful as it was, had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. As I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I allowed myself a small, deep breath. The anger and heartbreak would fade in time, but the clarity, the empowerment, and the lessons learned were permanent. And in that moment, I understood, the worst had happened, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and finally, in control of my own life. By the time everything was finalized, the annulment completed, my finances reclaimed, and my apartment feeling truly like my own, the calm I felt was almost surreal. I walked through the rooms that had once been heavy with tension, noticing how quiet and light they felt without the constant undertow of lies. I sold the nursery furniture, packed up the clothes I had bought, and arranged my space exactly how I wanted it, every detail a symbolic reclaiming of my life. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely without guilt, suspicion, or heartbreak pressing down on me. I realized that empowerment doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers quietly, a steady pulse beneath the chaos. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, nor did I need to chase false narratives or placate manipulation. I had learned the hard way that calm, deliberate action carries far more weight than explosive confrontation or vengeful acts. Sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I reflected on the betrayal, the deception, and the months of emotional turbulence, and for the first time, I could smile, not with relief alone, but with pride in my own resilience. Evenings now carried a different energy. The apartment no longer felt like a battlefield, but a sanctuary where I was in charge of my own life. I allowed myself to pursue passions I had shelved, spend time with friends and family without distraction, and focus on my career and personal growth. The sting of betrayal lingered, sure, but it no longer defined me. It was simply a reminder of the lessons learned, the strength gained, and the clarity achieved. I thought about how easily love could be twisted, and how important it was to trust instincts and boundaries, but I also recognized that hope and kindness still had their place. I had been deceived, manipulated, and tested, but I had emerged calm, composed, and fully in control. Walking away from the lies, from the manipulation, and reclaiming my life quietly was the ultimate victory. And as I closed the door behind me that evening, leaving the past where it belonged, I felt a profound sense of peace. The chaos was gone, the betrayal exposed, and I had finally taken back my life, calmly, deliberately, and with every ounce of dignity intact.